Welcome to another of our online reflections. People are often surprised when I tell them that two of my favourite books in the Bible are the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. In fact, there's more than one occasion when I've told people that and they've actually thought that I was joking because, yeah, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, of all the books in the Bible, are probably the most prescriptive and detailed that there are because they're the law codes of the nation of God's people. So, yeah, there are places when they go into an incredible amount of detail. Take Leviticus chapter 14, for example, which contains paragraphs about how to go through the ceremonial cleansing ritual after you have fumigated a house from a spreading or a scattered mold. A cleansing ritual which involves, amongst other things, 2 live birds, some cedar wood, some hyssop, some scarlet yarn, and a clay bowl full of clean water. And trust me, you really don't want to be the second bird in that particular ritual. Now, at one level, you could look at that and you could see it as some ancient ritual that belongs in a time and a culture that we left behind centuries ago. And as such, yeah, it does come across as a bit strange and perhaps even a little bit irrelevant. But it's a law code. It's the biblical equivalent of the terms and conditions that you tick the box to say that you've read because you want that lovely new smartphone or that cheaper energy deal or whatever else it is that you've signed up for. And why we read those terms and conditions, or at least why we say that we've read those terms and conditions, is because we recognise the value of what they represent. We want the thing that they define, whether that's the ownership of a new phone or the supply of energy into our home or the lease deal on a new car or the holiday that we've just booked or whatever it is those terms and conditions are for. And to me, that's why these books are so inspiring, because they are the terms and conditions for a nation that, if it really operated according to them, would be a wonderful place to live and to be. They are the terms and conditions of what it means to be God's chosen people. I mean, let's return to that cleansing ritual that I was talking about from Leviticus chapter 14. You know, at one level, it's a total faff, with priests dipping hyssop into bowls of water and sprinkled blood. But just stand back for a minute and ask yourself why the priest is doing that. They're doing that because some weeks earlier, someone woke up to find their house infected and rapidly becoming what we would describe today as unfit for human habitation. And God says to his people, I don't want that to happen. I don't want people to live like that. So when it does happen, I want the community to come together to make sure that the problem is solved. I want that person to know that if that happens to them, help is available. And I want the religious leaders to be at the very forefront of that, armed with instructions to recognise what's wrong and what needs to be done to put it right. And I want them to organise the community in coming round to support that household in getting things sorted. And when all that is done, and when the bricks have been removed and the walls have been rebuilt and the situation is resolved, and you're sure that the situation is resolved, I want you to come together as an act of worship and consecration. God paints a picture of a society that is not divided or driven by economic interests of a few. God paints a picture of a society where community well-being and religious organisation and worship are so interwoven that it's hard to tell where one starts and another one finishes. So to me, this is not some obscure ceremonial rite. It's a reflection of God's heart. It's a practical outworking of faith that doesn't offer itself as an alternative to practical intervention, but where each is an expression of the other. And yes, it might be wrapped up in the language of law and geared to the culture of its day, but as they become the lens through which we explore it, like all of our scriptures, it's a revelation. It's a glimpse into the nature of God and the purpose of God. And this is exactly how these Old Testament law books present themselves. Yes, they are full of all kinds of rituals and ideas that may seem strange when they're viewed from a very different culture from the one in which they were written. But they make absolutely clear that these are just the terms and conditions, the paragraphs of detail that are the outworking of one simple principle. And that principle is love. Love for God and love for our neighbour. In fact, the most emphatic command that appears in these law books comes right at the beginning. And it's outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So let me read from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 4 to 9. Because this is what it says. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as a symbol on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Now, if you've seen the size of the original scrolls of the book of Deuteronomy, you would know that there is no way that you could walk around with them tied to your forehead. And I don't know about fixing them to the door frames. You could probably make the door frames out of them. But devout followers of the Jewish faith since then and to this day have recognised that all of these laws and regulations are encapsulated in one sentence. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your strength. And if you read the Gospels, you hear Jesus reiterating this as he also affirms the subsequent principle of loving our neighbour as ourselves. And if we turn a couple of pages back in the book of Deuteronomy, we discover that God has a missional purpose for all of these laws. They're not just the laws for a nation of God's people. They're how every nation should be organised in God's eyes. And God's heart is that the other nations would see these being lived out and recognise their worth and value. But not only that, but that this would be a sign of God's living presence among his people. So let me read a couple of other verses from this book of Deuteronomy. This time, chapter 4 and verses 5 to 8. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all of these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them in the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws that I am setting before you today? This is what we might call, in today's speak, the wow factor of God's laws. Live these out, so that the other nations will look and will say, wow, what wisdom and understanding these people have. Wow, what a great community to be part of. Wow, what an amazing God they must serve. Wow, God must really be right there at the heart of that community. And maybe we can just take a moment to see that bigger picture that God's word is outlining here. This is a people who are called to love God and to love each other. And this is a people who are called to make it obvious that they love God and they love each other. And by loving God and loving each other, people around will take notice and they will recognise God as the living, reigning presence that the Bible repeatedly describes him as. But how is that love to be made known? How do people find out about this living, reigning God? By making numerous copies of the book of Deuteronomy and distributing it? By winning arguments? By putting up posters of their favourite verses from it? No, by living it out. And sure, they were encouraged to write key verses from it on their door frames and even sew them into the hems of their clothes, but not so that this might just be a kind of symbol, but so that it might serve as a common reminder to them that they were called to live out the love of God by the way that they went about their everyday lives, whether that was preparing food or taking care of strangers or clearing the mould off the walls of other people's houses. And as I think about all of that, I can't help but recognise how hundreds of years after these laws were first written, Jesus says exactly the same. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And as Jesus outlines in the verses preceding that, the love that he calls his followers to have for one another is an expression of the love that they find in God. Let the nations see the way you follow these laws. Follow these laws because they give practical expression to this call to love God and love each other. The statement of the opening part of the Old Testament law books and the statement of Jesus echo one another. And I want to invite you to simply spend some time reflecting on that resonance between these two realities. As far as the law books of the Old Testament were concerned, love wasn't something that you simply spoke about or agreed was a key attribute of God or agreed was a good idea. It was something to be lived out. Other nations would work out that God was love because they saw God's people acting in love by caring for the vulnerable and supporting those who were afflicted and considering the needs of others above their own. You know, terms and conditions are important, particularly if things go wrong. You know, we often like to have those guarantee clauses and those contracts to fall back on. But I do wonder sometimes if over the years we've allowed our faith to simply be defined by the terms and conditions of the New Testament, so to speak. You know, we're very clear about what we believe, and we would be horrified at the suggestion that God was anything but love. We sing hymns about God's love. We can recite verses from the Bible about God's love. But how are we expressing God's love in our lives and our actions and our values and the way that we treat others? It seems to me that the inescapable question that books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus ask us is exactly that. Which is why, as I said at the outset, I consider them to be really significant. But there is another side to this coin, because it's also important that these things don't just become an end in themselves, but they do remain an expression of love. You know, there's a very well-known passage in the New Testament book of 1 Corinthians that warns against the danger of doing all the right things, but not acting out of love. I might speak with the eloquence of earth and heaven, says Paul the writer, but if I haven't got love, I'm just a clanging gong. I might speak words of prophecy and fathom the deepest mysteries of our faith, but if love is absent, then frankly it is of no worth. And I may be able to make the greatest of sacrifices that anyone could make, but if I'm not acting out of love, it's just an empty sham. It seems to me that at the heart of the Christian message is that these two are inescapably linked. God does not call us to talk about love. He calls us to live and to act in love in every aspect of our community life. And God does not call us to simply do nice things or to get involved in good causes and to run good activities, because if these things are not an expression of genuine love for God and for each other, then, according to Paul, they're pointless. And so, as you ponder on what I would describe as the two sides of this same coin, perhaps you might reflect on how these two come together in your life. And as you think, therefore, about your love for God, how are you expressing that? How is that reflected in the way that you treat others and go about things? And this is something we can live out in lockdown as much as anywhere else. And as you think about the things you're doing at the moment, what's your motivation for doing them? How are these an expression of your love for God and your love for your neighbour? Would those who are watching recognise that God is at the centre of your life? But let's remember that the passage of time between those Old Testament law books being written and Jesus declaring that people will know that we're his followers through our love for one another is about the same ballpark period of time between now and when Jesus said it. You know, an awful lot has changed over the centuries in between. But that underlying principle hasn't. If we want to be a people who can be recognised as being those amongst whom the living God resides, if we want others to recognise the living God, then we need to be a people who are defined by God's love and who display God's love in action. Thanks for listening.